So, all right, let's get started.
Yeah.
So, Clay, I think one of the fundamental things that I think we wanted to talk about was like, what is your method for balancing your sounds? For fuck's sake. All right, no more randos.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Keep it. No new friends.
no new friends. Sorry, if I don't know you, you're not getting in on the Zoom. Okay, so let's talk about balance first.
Sure.
So when I'm in the mix, like a lot of times, like what I do is like because here's the deal. Here's like the kind of like, oh, Andrew, your tracks are really like loud and like kind of wild, but like, you know, over compressed and all that stuff. Here's the deal. Here's why that is that I learned to mix in a rock and roll studio where you make everything as loud as possible because there's so much hum on the line from the distortion pedals.
Sure.
That, you know, that like you can't, like if you got like a headroom and then you crank it up, it's just gonna be like, you know, super loud and annoying. So I'm about like kissing, you know, like hanging out in the yellow for sure. Sorry, Juan David Gonzalez. So that's kind of where I come from. So now when I do my mixing, I do my gain staging, and I guess maybe that's where we start, is like a basic gain stage approach of like my kick is like the loudest thing in the mix, then like the snare is like the second loudest, the hats are just under that, and the synths are just under that, and like the bass line's kind of up there with the kick. That's kind of how I do it, because that's kind of how you would do a rock and roll record. Yeah. Catherine Carrasco, we know her, right? Right?
I don't know. Doesn't pop out to me.
Hold on. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, there's a lot of different ways to think about that. And I think, as with almost everything that we'll talk about, it's all like a track per track basis.
Absolutely. There's no formula.
Right. So the biggest thing that I really have locked into with studio stuff that helps me with consistency has been to like take a SPL measurement of pink noise through my monitors at 85 decibels and mark a measurement of the loudness of the room. And like, I know where like my monitor controller has to be sitting to have pink noise hit 85 decibels. And like pink noise is just an even spread of frequencies in noise. So it's not curved, it's like flat top to bottom. So then I try to work at the same place with my volume when I'm mixing. And obviously there are times where I might turn down or turn up to hear what happens when the volume changes, but right. keeping a consistent level of monitor output has helped a lot with just having gain staging and balance be natural, because it's like, then I also spend a lot of time listening to music at that same point with the monitor control, and just get used to hearing music at that point. And then, if you're always, and that kind of comes from like film mixers where I first heard about that. But
okay, I was going to say, I mean, it makes total sense, but I've never heard of anyone actually doing that.
Yeah, and it's cool because you just get the natural, like, I don't like to really think about numbers too much. And if I just am always working at the same marker on the monitor control, then it's just like I know what a kick sounds like in a track that has a really forward punchy kick, and I know what a kick feels like when it's really tucked away and subby, and I just can do those things instinctively, and that helps a lot because some tracks you want very different things from your kick drums or your snare drums or hi-hats, whatever. So that's a big tip, I would say, that's been helpful. And then I used to do a lot, like when I was really first learning mixing, is you can mix against pink noise. And there's a bunch of videos about that on YouTube, so I don't really need to go too deep into it, but you're basically running a pink noise generator in your session and bringing all your faders down. And then you're just like slowly pushing things up against pink noise. And when it just starts to become audible over the pink noise, you just like move on to the next instrument, and you can kind of then take away the pink noise and you have a reasonably balanced rough mix to start from. But that's kind of like, I did it in the beginning a lot, but I don't really do that anymore. It's not really, I would rather just do things by feel at this point. And so, yeah, I don't know, with gain staging, I don't really have like a ton of technical things to offer.
Well, no, but this methodology though, this kind of like, you know, this is like the way that you would basically calibrate like the color of the printer.
Sure.
It's like a calibration exercise.
I mean, I would say that like it's definitely not something. I think it comes from like doing the live front of house mixing. Like I'm using pink noise all the time in that setting to hear a space that I'm not familiar with and identify frequencies that are missing or exaggerated. And so it's just like something I'm really used to, like identifying pink noise quickly, and it does help, and it's really easy to get the hang of because pink noise is flat from the lowest frequencies to the highest frequencies. So if you put on some pink noise in your room and it's like, this is super bright, you just, you know, like my room is super bright and I need to think about that when I'm putting my tracks together, you know?
Yeah.
It's a way that like you can make assessments about your room without knowing any specific numbers or frequencies, because everybody can say like, oh, that's bassy or that's bright.
Right. Yeah. It's a completely subjective kind of almost arbitrary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's super fascinating. And I kind of have always dreamed of doing something like that, but I've never. So how can someone get into that? Like if I'm like a new producer or something like that, and I kind of want to like have this kind of more calibrated thing, is it something that is like mega pricey, or is it just like a matter of like, you know, you get one of those big mixer knobs or whatever? Like, what do you think?
Oh, you mean in terms of keeping a steady volume output?
Yeah.
No, because I mean, can you see you can see my screen, right?
Absolutely.
Can you see when I adjust the volume on my keyboard? Do you get that like readout? Or are you only seeing Ableton?
Only Ableton.
Okay, so I mean, you know what that looks like when you're on your keyboard, you have volume control.
Oh wait, no, do it again. No, I can see that. So you just
okay,
know you're like
so,
dots up.
Well, I'm just saying, like, if you didn't have a monitor controller and you didn't even have monitors, I mean, it helps when you're working on speakers because you can measure the sound pressure levels from your listening position. But even if you're working in headphones, if you just decide, I'm gonna make my tracks at this level, and you just know it's like, that's 10 clicks up, and you always work at that same spot, then it's like, even in headphones, you're just setting an arbitrary listening level. And if you just always listen to things at that level, that can be as simple as just knowing that you're working 10 clicks up on your keyboard measurement, or if you have a monitor controller or something, that just stays in that position when you're mixing. So it's definitely not anything that requires you to buy stuff.
No, that's really important though, because I think a lot of people think that, precision equals money.
Sure.
But what you're saying, and what I'm liking, is that precision doesn't necessarily, precision just means precision.
Yeah, there's a bunch.
Like it just means like don't touch the fucking knob, leave the knob at 50% or something like that.
And that's not even just like, it's valuable to also check what your mix sounds like when it's really quiet and when it's really loud.
Yeah.
So it's not saying that like 100% of the time I'm keeping the volume at this one place, but I have a working volume, and I also check louder and quieter at different moments in time throughout the mix. But like 90% of the time, I'm working at the same volume marker with the same speakers. I don't really use headphones a lot, except to like check things like reverbs and like fades at the moment. But you can do the same thing with headphones. And it also is like, it's great just to establish consistency, but it also is really helpful when dealing with ear fatigue. Like if you're in the studio for 12 hours a day.
Like I am.
Right, and by the end of that time, like, your ears definitely start to go, and most people's reaction is to continually be pushing the volume throughout the day. And you're like, oh, this shit sounds quiet now, but you didn't change the volume, so then like my ears are tired, maybe I should take a 5-minute break because all of a sudden the mix started to feel quiet. And it's like, it just gives you that indicator as well, that like my senses are a little off because this isn't sounding like what it's supposed to be, but it's at the same place that it's always at. So that's cool too. I'm all about like taking breaks and giving your ears a rest and not blowing your shit out. Helps you work longer,
No, I mean, that's ultimately, it's like, I see this as a kind of it's a borderline sport.
Júrame que tu amor será para siempre. Júrame, júrame, júrame que estarás.
It was, whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's really, I mean, this is really fascinating because, I know all about ear fatigue. What would you recommend? So like, let's say somebody like who's in my situation right now, where like, I've just got a room in a house. Oh no, anyway, I just got like a room in a house, and I need to be able to work like 12 hours, but I can't necessarily monitor all 12 hours,
Sure.
It basically, the same principle probably works for headphones, right?
Yeah, it totally could.
Okay.
You just always keep your headphone output at the same, you just mark, like, I would recommend that you like figure that out someday at the beginning of the day when your ears are really fresh, of just like running through reference tracks. And I wouldn't pink your headphones because that's harsh. But
yeah,
just putting on reference tracks and finding like what is like a point where like I can hear the low frequencies and I can hear like the space and the clarity, but it's not maxed out, because you want to be able to check louder always. So you don't want to like start at 100. Because, so like you want to give yourself a few clicks on the keyboard control for volume, like maybe somewhere in the middle, and then you have room to go up and down, and you just always know like 6 clicks up or 10 clicks up or whatever is the point that is your working volume. And if you spend a few days just going through reference tracks at that point, and if you're just chilling on your computer listening to music on the headphones, like, and it's at that volume all day long after like a week or two, it just becomes like that's where a kick drum should sit at that level. And it starts to just become like a natural understanding of the way that things feel in a mix at a certain level.
Yeah. We're on the subject of gain staging. Let's talk about redlining in Ableton.
Yeah.
So, I do it. right? You know, I do
Yeah.
it from time to time, you know. Is it that bad?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
try to convince me, like, if I was like your little brother, try to convince me to like never redline in Ableton again.
no. Well,
Here's
the
Mo.
thing.
Here's Mo.
Cool. That, you know, it's like this is the one that I prepared the most notes for because I knew you wanted to talk about it.
Okay, awesome. You got notes. I'm ready.
You know, like there's obviously like a difference, and I think you know that between analog and digital clipping.
Right.
And so, you know, with an analog console or piece of equipment, whatever it is, like you're clipping and it's distorting the sound, but it's a much softer form of distortion. Like you're probably not losing as much of the original character of the sound when you clip in analog domain. And digital clipping is way harsher and way louder, and you tend to like lose a lot more of the original frequency. Okay, but technically most software programs, any DAW, at this point in time, unless you're using something old, they're probably all using floating point audio.
Okay, so I don't know what that is. What is that?
Okay, it just means that like your audio is like you're showing red on the meter, but because the DAW is using floating point audio, it's not technically clipping. It's just super fucking loud.
Okay.
And the thing that is clipping is your digital to analog converter, whether it's the built-in headphone out on your computer or your sound card or whatever.
Okay.
So in theory, the audio inside the DAW is not actually clipping if you're working in 32-bit floating point audio, which most modern DAWs are. That's a whole fucking load of science that I don't have any claim to be an expert on, and I don't think anybody really needs to be an expert on unless you're like building software. But it's just a technical point that like you can have plus 60 dB in 32-bit floating point audio, and technically it's not clipping inside the box. It's
right.
clipping on the way out, and it's going to sound bad because that's creating digital clipping going into your converter. So, you know, I guess maybe like the decent example is you can take a channel and, you know, max your clip gain, and it's going to be super blown out.
Right.
But then you can turn down your master channel a bunch, and the resulting audio is not going to be super fucked up.
See?
But the thing is that I would say to keep in mind is that like there's a few reasons that I would not recommend making a clip 60 dB louder and turning your master down 60 dB.
Okay.
It's kind of like, first of all, it's silly because
sure,
you're like, why? But if you're using any plugins that are modeling analog gear, like you know, any of the UAD or Waves or anything that's an emulation of a hardware piece of gear, those plugins all have a sweet spot where they like to receive incoming audio. And you can read the manuals and figure that out.
Yeah. Okay.
But I don't do that. I'm not a manual person. I like to just fuck around with things.
No, we're techno dudes, man. Techno's not
Right.
about manual, man.
But you will find if you test stuff that if you're feeding into certain plugins, they react better or worse, and worse can sometimes be what you want, you know? So, but it's just a thing to keep in mind that when you're clipping, like, and clipping in quotation marks, because like we said, it's not technically clipping. It's just like, it can affect your final audio output, even if you correct it later down the line.
Yeah.
Because some of those plugins that you're using might not be happy with it. And if those, then like this, I just set up a really simple null test. Basically, you have 2 copies of the same audio with one of them having the phase flipped. So if I just play this by itself, I lost my thing. It's just a drum loop, right? And then I have the same thing here, phase flipped. So the phase is flipped. Now if I play both of those together, there's no sound.
It should be silent, right? I don't know that much, but I know that.
I pulled it off a little bit. I fucked that up. Anyways, let me fix this because it matters.
Because it matters.
Okay, so they're at the same exact volume, one phase flip, there's no audio coming out. But if I put on a limiter now,
yeah,
you're gonna hear the difference between the 2 channels. And this, I just threw on like the basic L3 7 dB threshold, -7 threshold.
okay.
So you're just gonna hear what the limiter is doing and not the meat of the track.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's 6 dB reduction. That's like a pretty, it's not an insane amount of limiting. It's maybe a little bit heavy, but you can hear the distortion in that.
Yes.
Compared, so if you have signals that are super hot feeding into an analog emulation of a SSL compressor.
Yeah.
And the compressor is already not happy with the gain that it's getting. So then that's creating some distortions. And then down the line, you're limiting your master output or your bus output or whatever. That distortion is only going to be even more distorted because your compressor on that bus or on that channel or whatever is receiving a super hot signal, and that plugin doesn't necessarily process your floating point audio in the same way that just like your DAW in general does. So that's kind of the main thing to keep in mind with like, is clipping okay? Like theoretically clipping your channel and then turning it down later is not bad, but you just have to think about the buildup of all those distortions and artifacts through the whole line of the track to your final output.
Right.
And there's certain sonic characteristics that you might be totally cool with, and it might be bad or fucked up in theory, but it sounds cool, and that's good for us because we're not in the business of like right and wrong, but whether it sounds cool or not. But it's just something to keep in mind is like, is this giving me the desired result? Because there are many ways to enhance your perceived loudness, and maybe slamming your clip gain into a compressor and a limiter is actually potentially giving you less perceived volume on the way out.
Yep.
You know, there's a lot of different ways to work to that point. Because like I was saying, when you're comparing digital versus analog clipping, digital clipping, you tend to lose more of the like low and low mid frequencies. So it might really be taking away from the desired results. So I think that kind of covers my take on like the is it cool to clip your channels? Like, yeah, sure, but
Sure, right.
also keep in mind what you're doing to the sound.
Okay, that's really helpful, and I think that, I mean, I don't know, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that makes me, you know, kind of have some questions about like, well, okay, how do we make shit louder without, you know, like, because what I'm looking for as an artist is I'm looking for like the pathways that aren't like crushing it with a limiter or like way over compressing, like how to, like nuanced techniques, like mix techniques, EQ techniques. And I think once we get into the more nitty gritty of like the individual tracks, I think we can talk about that in a little more detail.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's like the topic of maximizing your perceived loudness is like a huge fucking conversation.
No, I mean, I know. Yeah.
There's so many different takes on it and so many different ways to get there, and that could easily be an entire podcast series of its own that goes on for 2 years. Like,
yeah.
But we can definitely talk about some ideas.
I think what would be most helpful for me, and I think helpful for everyone here, would just be like, I think we don't have to do it yet, but I think let's just talk about that stuff when we get into the individual tracks. Because I find, I mean, for me, it's like not all of my tracks have to be loud as fuck. You know, it just depends on the vibe of the track. It's like some tracks are fucking loud because they're, you know, from the Limit project, which the whole point of that project is to make shit as loud as fuck.
Yeah.
You know, but it's like the MIDI master stuff, you know, or like the Jasen Loveland stuff doesn't have to be that loud. It's more about the mix, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I would say like if it's club music in general, obviously, right? Like we are not concerned with like Spotify and Apple Music loudness matching kind of stuff. We want shit to hit loud and punchy in the club, and you know, there's kind of that competitive element of like, if my track sounds louder than the last one that you just mixed out of, then like I'm winning, right?
I have seen some people totally face plant with that though.
Oh yeah.
Like Submit X, X, dude, that track is so fucking loud. And like I've seen it, just DJs just get flattened by like mixing out of Submit X into like something reasonable.
Yeah. But you remember that track and not the one they mixed out.
Well, you just
like, I mean, I'm not trying to say that like the goal should be loud as fuck always, but and that track also is like, I guess we'll get into all of this, like you said, when we start breaking down tracks, but like that's a great example of how to like really make stuff pop and stay gritty and be loud, but it's not like super muddy or murky, you know. That's a really good example from recent years of like a track that is really loud, it really pops, and it doesn't really sacrifice the like tonal characteristics of each individual sound in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna pause there for a second. And Nahal pointed out correctly that yes, we're talking about Geschloten Circles track Submit X. If you're not familiar with it, I strongly recommend YouTubing it. Like honestly, pause the video and listen to the track because it's a banger. But also, most of Geschloten Circles stuff is kind of a tour de force in slotting one sound in between the other sounds to make them all pop. Classic banger.
Yeah.
You know, it's got that vocal. Anyway, enough of Geschloten Circle. He's a hack. No. So let's you know what? Why don't we jump into a track? Why don't we, you got one loaded up?
Yeah, I pulled the 2 session files that you had mentioned.
Great.
Which do you have a particular
television, man?
You have a particular one you want to check first?
Let's just start with the title track from Chemistry and Love.
All right, I think that's...
And maybe just play a bit, play like 2 minutes of it, so if people aren't familiar with it, they can get the vibe, and then we'll start breaking it down.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the one. I'm bad at renaming things when we decide on a finished name.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm still working off your titles for these pieces. Okay, so this is the raw session. There's no master bus processing on this file.
Oh, cool.
And so we can just like, I'll just play through this like first breakdown area, and then we can just start looking at tracks, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. We get to the part where it starts to really slap. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, you get the idea there. Anything that you want to touch on specifically there, or just?
So I think let's start kind of picking up on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. By the way,
No.
let's just kind of pick up where we're leaving off the discussion. So let's talk about the drums. How do you have the drums organized on this tune? Can you show us?
Yeah, super simple. I guess what would this shit? So these tracks were done really simply in terms of processing. Like I didn't really go too crazy. Whereas some stuff that I do, I end up with like almost as many buses and sends as there are channels in the track. But like, I think that when we were talking about this project, when it first started to take shape, was kind of like referencing classic electro stuff. So
yeah,
it just made sense to like keep it very simple and almost keep it like as simple as it would be if you were mixing this shit on a like 16 channel Mackie at home back in the day.
Yeah.
In a very vague kind of way.
Right.
So we're just working with one drum bus and then one drum reverb.
Okay.
And like nothing special there, just some reverb on the snare, a little bit of low and high frequency roll off, like absolutely nothing impressive, just for a little space on that. And there's some hi-hats in there as well. And then,
oh yeah.
What's up?
No, could you switch to the mixer view?
The mixer view, sure.
The clip view, because I just want to see the proportions of the gains and how they match up.
Okay, yeah. So the stuff I just highlighted here is the drums. So the first 8 channels. And
cool.
That, you know, like that might not be the most informative thing because they were from the Behringer 808.
Oh, okay.
And so there was, you know, some gain on the individual channels on the way in.
Okay.
So there was a rough gain staging on the machine itself, tracked out individual channels, except for, so like this is the 808 snare on its own, super high pitch.
Yeah.
And I layered that with a snare sample. It's just the Ableton 808 snare, but you can see like I just fucking bombed the lower part of that snare, and that's getting a little. I'll unfreeze this and we can look at the. So the glue compressor is not doing anything. I'm just using it for soft clipping. So I'm not compressing that. I just have the soft clipper on and I push the makeup gain into the clipper, just to give it a little bit more of that body and some saturation. And yeah, you can see here, it's like, it's all about this, just bringing out that fundamental frequency of that snare drum. And then putting those two together, like, you almost don't even hear that higher snare.
No, you don't, but it's there.
It goes into the reverb more than the lower snare, and it just adds like a little bit more air on the top of it. It's not anything major. So yeah, like, and then you know, there's probably, I don't know for sure, but I definitely like adjusted clip gains after doing the gains on the individual channels of the drum machine.
Okay.
And then the snare is like, the snare and the hi-hats in this reverb, which is just like it's kind of long, but just a long plate, and it's tucked away just to add some extra space in the high frequencies and help like give it a little bit more width. And then the main drum bus is just like all about getting some crunch on it. If I turn that stuff off, you can hear like tons of clicky stuff and tons of noise.
Yep.
and just like using the saturators. This NLS bus is a pretty cool thing on drum buses. There's a Spike is SSL, mic is API, I think, and then Nevo is Neve. It just models different consoles, and I'm not doing anything with it except adding some drive, which is like an SSL style console drive. Then F6, just some EQ shaping on the drum bus as a whole. I kind of like to, I'm a big fan of top-down mixing, so I'm kind of doing broad strokes on buses and groups, and then if I have to, I'll go back and get surgical on an individual element. But I tried.
Okay.
Like, so my first move is to like level the drums out and just listen to the drums on the speakers and be like, that's a good like starting point for a rough mix of just the drums. And then I'll bus those. And sometimes there's multiple buses, sometimes it's just one, it depends. And then I kind of shape the bus to get that where I want it. And then if there's like a ringing in a hi-hat or a snare resonant frequency that is really bothering me that pops, because it's also like, I guess I'll just pop this up too while we're here. Like then we're hitting the SSL compressor on the way out of this bus. So I'm EQing into the compressor. And that's also not doing a whole lot. Like 2 or 3 decibels of reduction, like not anything major. So once the compressor's there and the general color EQ is there, then I might go back and start cutting things out. And I like that because it's faster, and also everything changes once you put compression on it. And you know, so I don't like to get super surgical on individual sounds until I have a rough mix going into the bus. And I did do some surgical cuts on the bus because those are probably points where multiple instruments are overlapping and creating some resonance. So it's like, if I can hear that it's a spike because of the way that the snare transient and the hi-hat are interacting, I'll cut it on the bus. If I can hear that it's something that's only in the snare, or only in a tom, or only in the hi-hat, I'm gonna go to that individual channel and try to take care of that frequency after it's going into the compressor, so that I really know that I'm taking out the right amount or adding the right amount. So that's the basics of the drum bus.
That's super helpful, because I think a lot of people, and myself, I will sometimes do this. I'm more of like a filterer than an EQer. But I think a lot of people either over EQ or under EQ. I don't think a lot of people kind of hit that sweet spot. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's so hard. I definitely spent a long time like way overdoing EQ, and you just kill the sounds.
It makes everything sound like antiseptic.
Right, you either like lose all of your clarity, or it gets really thin, or like you get phasing problems from getting so crazy with cutting out like very thin cues. You know, like I guess I don't really know here, because this is kind of an older session. I did do pretty tight cues, but you know, like sometimes that's necessary if it's really just one ringing frequency. But I also was listening to somebody talk recently about mixing, and they were kind of just like, you know, like 4 was the sweet spot on the SSL for a cue to cut something out. So I've even been trying to back off my cues lately and not go so tight with the cues, because it does really get like, if you just have like a ton of these like really spiked notches, you definitely start to get into some weird phasey territories. And like, you know, it depends. Certain EQ plugins will give you different phase options. You can do like linear phase stuff, and that's all cool and it can help. But no matter what you're doing, like if you put 20 really, really narrow spiky cuts into a sound, you're fucking with the overtone series and the harmonics of the original sound. And then it's like, at the end of the day, that's kind of the point where it's like, maybe you just go back and change the sound. Because if you have to get that crazy, like, I think in general, the whole thing with EQing is like, it's a good lesson to have in mind. It's like, if I'm going crazy with EQ, then like, there's something fundamentally wrong.
Well, yes. Let's stop for a minute and talk about that, because that was when I realized that was like a big, huge. That was like it was like, you know, when they talk about in the Bible, like the scales fell off my eyes. You know, it was like that's, you know, when it's kind of like when, let's say you make a patch on a synth, and it's for me it was like learning about like basically like what was the natural like frequency range that certain sounds want to be at. Sure. Like, you know, like if a sound has a kind of disposition, right? Like this is a bright sound, or that's a bass sound, or that's a whatever sound.
Yeah.
You know, I would basically make stuff that would be like, I was only, because I wasn't listening to the whole sound. I was only listening to the part that I wanted to hear. Like, oh, I need a bass line. So like, I'm gonna make this farty sound, and I like only a couple, like a very narrow frequency band of this sound. And then I would try endlessly to EQ the shit out of it to make it work, but that's not how sound works.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, I don't know, there's certain times where like, yeah, you can get surgical with stuff, but it's really important to not overdo it. And I mean, I think like a really good, just like exercise, you know, maybe not something that you would apply in like a full track, but if you want to like just work on the basics of EQing, is like, just if you're in Ableton, I don't know, like I think a lot of other DAWs have the same setups, or there's probably free plugins that do this, but like just fucking mix a track with EQ3 and filters. Like that's what a console has.
Yeah, right.
Is like, it's just low, high, and mid, and maybe if you're lucky, your console has adjustable frequency bands, and then you get filters on the top and the bottom. And like, that's actually enough. If in the same way that like, I don't know, I personally like don't take a lot of inspiration from techno people or dance music people talking about mixing, because I think for the most part, like, you know, hot take, but like most dance music is not mixed well.
No, it's not.
Like, I mean, only purely from a technical standpoint. Yeah, like, I mean, I love that shit, and that fact that it's not mixed well is oftentimes what makes it so special. But if I want to learn about mixing, I'm not really interested in learning about it from dance music producers. So anyways, you know, how many amazing sounding records were made on a console? You know, endless number. And did they need 16 bands of EQing on every single instrument? No, because they recorded the sounds good on the way in. Like, the stuff sounded good from the take, from the performance, and those musicians and their recording engineers spent a lot of time in the studio getting the sound right and getting the arrangement right and playing it the right way before they even put the track down. So that is like, yeah, that's good stuff to keep in mind. Like, if you're doing like crazy shit to a sound, unless it's like crazy spatial processing, because like there's a difference between taking a sine wave and turning it into like this insane sound design thing and trying to make a snare drum sound good. Like, if you're doing like crazy surgery on a snare drum, it's the wrong snare drum. Or the gain is wrong or something. Like, it's not, you don't need to to go that crazy with stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think also for me, I don't know if you find this, and maybe you have this so internalized because of your training in jazz, but you know, when I kind of like clued into the fact that like a band is the way a band is, like, you know, bass, drums, high, because that's how you occupy the frequency spectrum.
Sure.
In some sense. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like, you know, it's kind of like if you're making a bass sound, like think of the frequency range of like something like an upright bass. Like that kind of nails it. Like, you know, you can change the dynamics and stuff like that, but that pocket, so like, yeah, I mean, you know, again, the amateur thing that I used to do many times would be like, you know, take a snare drum sound and try to turn it into like a bass line or something like that, which is totally possible thanks to the miracle of digital technology.
Yeah.
But like the easiest way to do that is use a wavetable.
Right.
You know, and then like you're done.
Yep.
I just protected us from some spammers.
Yeah. I mean, like that. I think it's really hard. I mean, even with that understanding of playing music in bands, it's really difficult when you're trying to make sense of the way that, like, because when you're playing a band, you don't think about that because it's just like, this is the low E string on my bass, this is the low E string on my guitar, this is where I play chords, the drummer plays the drums, whatever. And when you're trying to like sit here and first of all, I mean, I don't think that mixing is that important to think about in the beginning of the production journey anyways. Like, you should just make tracks and they'll sound like shit, but you just learn how to write songs and make arrangements, whatever. And then
no one ever was like, this is a garbage tune, but boy, it's mixed really well, let's play it.
Right.
That's
so I think like mixing should definitely not, unless you're going to only be a mix engineer, mixing should not be the primary focus. It should just be like, learn how to write cool tracks.
Yeah.
But then when you start to get into like, I want my stuff to sound better because that's my artistic vision for this thing, it's really hard to make sense of, because like I was saying, like, you don't think about it, you just play the bass line. You're not thinking about like, that's 44 hertz.
Right.
When I play my low E string. And when you're EQing, then you have to start making sense of frequencies and how frequencies overlap with each other, and how you get things to occupy space. And it gets really, I think everyone has to do that and goes through that process of over EQing, under EQing, over compressing, under compressing, and then eventually, like, just throughout the perseverance of like continually doing this thing over and over and over again, it's just like, oh, now I understand compression, even though like nothing changed. It's just, you just compress sounds a million times, and then suddenly you stop thinking about compression.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also one thing to be said that I think a lot of people, like, I think, like, we're gonna veer off the script a little bit and like just shoot off some fucking random space thoughts and stuff. But I mean, I think that's one thing, you know, I like to, ever since the lockdown, I've been spending a bunch of time on Discord. Because it's like an even nerdier version of Slack.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've been hanging out with a lot of like much younger producers who are super talented, but a lot of these producers are kind of separate. Like, I mean, that's how you end up online. You know, you don't have any real friends. So, yeah, I did it too. So it's, you know, you didn't have any real friends, so you just got to find friends on the internet.
Right.
And you know, nothing but love for that. And so it's kind of like a lot of people are kind of isolated and all learning in their own ways. And this is kind of what happened to me. I was in the burbs, had no idea what I was fucking doing, but I didn't even have YouTube. But like, what's interesting is with like the YouTube tutorial culture, which you can learn every fucking thing you ever wanted on YouTube, but you're only going to learn like the one way to do that one thing that you wanted to learn.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, I mean, it's funny because it's the type of stuff that like the librarian would tell you in school, and you're like, oh, that's fucking stupid. But it's like you have to vet your sources. Like,
Yeah.
there
It's
is
like,
tons
who's
of it.
dope kick drum? Like some bullshit
Right.
EDM dope kick drum, or like Jeff Mills's? Because Jeff
Even,
Mills is gonna teach you the wrong way to do it too.
yeah, but even down to things like, you know, like these ideas that like you gotta sidechain your bass to your kick if you want them to sound good together, and like that
Right.
sounds weird and scientific.
Yeah.
And it also takes away from the beautiful thing about the low end on a sound system is the overlap of frequencies between the sub and the kick, and like
Yeah. Absolutely.
the fact that like you have to send your file to a mastering engineer in -6 dB, like they're just weird things that like are propagated as like fact that are not really like, it's not black and white. And so there's tons of, and I learn shit from YouTube all the fucking time.
Yeah. It's not a diss on YouTube, but it's a
But yeah, there's people
kind of
learning
criticality and an experience, I guess.
Yeah, and yeah, there's people learning and making really cool stuff from Discord and YouTube and whatever, and there's also people making like really mindless generic stuff because they just learned from YouTube. And like
Dude,
part of the,
go to any techno, like proper techno Discord, it's all there is.
yeah, and that's because like the reason that Jeff Mills is cool and the reason that Juan Atkins is cool, and you know, anybody all the way down the line from the beginning stages of it, like the people who have a unique sound, it's because they figured out how to use their instruments by themselves. Like,
Absolutely.
and it's just like you develop your own interaction and language with the machines or the synths that you have in your computer or whatever, and you have to fuck stuff up a million times and figure out how to get it to sound good to make unique stuff. And if you're just kind of like doing paint by numbers from tutorials, it's never going to be that interesting.
Yeah, I find I totally agree with that sentiment, and I think you put it really eloquently, Clay. And you know, it's interesting. There was a comment in the chat about like, well, I feel like mixing is a buzzkill, which I think a lot of people do. I do. I mean, like when I was working with Patrick and he was tweaking the hi-hats, I went and took a nap.
Yeah.
But there is a way to do it. I think like kind of what you're touching on is it like, you know, I don't necessarily want to overly lionize the originators of our music, but they are the originators of our music and we are following in their footsteps.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, it's like, you gotta kind of kiss the rings a little bit, but it's like the figuring shit out factor is so critical. I mean, you know, that's how we got Acid House. That's like, it was like this thing at a fucking pawn shop, and like the 303 is impossible to use without a manual, but like Pierre and Spanky and those guys like fucking figured out how to make it do something.
Yeah.
And
I would also say that, like, I mean, if mixing is a buzzkill, there are ways to kind of streamline that process. And like if mix, I think in the same way that like if you're really over EQing a snare, and that might mean that it's just the wrong snare, like if mixing is that big of a buzzkill, then it might just be that it might just be that your workflow is not the right setup for you, or like you're overcomplicating the mixing process, because like at the end of the day, it's like mixing is about levels and frequencies and space, and like it's, if you are really like, I mean, I guess it's also just the kind of thing that like when you're learning something, like it's never fun to not be good at something. So
that's a super good point. I mean,
Like-
I'm gonna like just loop that part of the video for a second, like when I go to edit this.
Yeah, like it might just be that like give it some time and it might work out, but and it also in terms of the workflow maybe not being the right workflow for you. I mean, the way I mix changes every single track and every
Yeah.
single song.
Yeah.
The way that I process a bus, like the way that I did this is not at all how I have
Would
set
do it
up
today, or
something that I did yesterday or whatever.
Yeah.
And the way that like I process the master bus is not the same as it was 2 weeks ago, stuff like that. It's always evolving, and like just listening to other people and getting at ideas and trying stuff. And that's kind of fun because you're keeping the process evolving. But like I said, like don't overthink the mix. Like you're just, you know, like especially if you're early on in like a production journey, if you're really like, if you've been producing tracks for like 10 years and you still think that mixing is a drag, then like maybe just have somebody else mix your tracks.
That's a
cool.
come to Jesus moment for me.
That's totally cool to like.
And I don't think mixing is a drag anymore, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, same. I was not good at mixing when I first started making tracks, and then I like ended up doing front of house live mixing. Like it's a thing that like if you have to learn it, and it's not really like there's nothing magical or mysterious really about compression, EQ, delay, reverb, saturation. Like that's a mix.
Yeah.
That's all it is. There's an infinite number of tools to achieve those things, but like that's the whole process. Ultimately.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think from the Loveland world, the really the kind of, you know, I'm not really one to give mix advice because my mixes are just, they're not good or bad, they're weird in their mind. And I like them. Yeah. Not everyone does, but I like them. But I think a lot of times too, like when you talk to producers and they think mixing is a drag, it is because it's kind of no fun to not be good at something, but it's also no fun to not know kind of what standard to hold your work to.
Sure.
It's kind of like if you're thinking that your track sounds like shit and you're listening to like Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, which is a great, you know, a super well engineered record.
Yeah.
Your shit is gonna sound like garbage. Or a Steely Dan record, it's gonna sound like garbage.
Yeah.
And you're gonna beat yourself against the wall trying to but it's like, dude, perfection is the enemy of finishing tracks. You can always go back, and it's up to you as the producer, as the musician, as the creative person to put them out in the world or not. And so what I like to do is if I have tracks that I'm like really kind of like question mark about, I get them done, I finish them as much as I can, maybe just go a little quick with some of the mixing, and then let them sit for a couple weeks. Come back, listen to them, and then it's like a whole new world. That's like a mega tip, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
that out, it was just like, dude, why didn't I do this earlier?
Yeah, I do mix as I go. Like as I'm producing, I'm mixing, which also might be worth trying if mixing is a drag. Like I mentioned when we first started opening this up, this idea of like top-down mixing is like I set my buses up and I shape my buses and I mix into my buses, and that way I already have some compression and saturation on those channels. It's already feeling beefier. It's already kind of balanced, and you can tell if something is off in the levels, because if your compressor is fucking pinning every time the kick hits, your kick is too loud. You know, like it helps you make decisions and adjustments by.
You almost use the compressor as like an analysis tool.
Sure, you can. I mean, I wouldn't say that's the purpose of having it there.
No, but you can.
But you can, yeah, totally.
I mean, that's cool. Like that's not usually on the. When you look up compressor on Wikipedia, it doesn't say like is helpful for analyzing sounds.
Yeah. I would say something that I think is really fascinating that I have started adapting a little bit more is if you look up, I would highly recommend like checking some videos and interviews with him. A mix engineer, Michael Brower.
Okay.
Probably like the stuff he's worked on is largely not interesting to anybody who's listening here. He mixes like Coldplay and John Mayer and stuff. He also did a bunch of like classic soul records, Aretha Franklin stuff. But he's got a very, very intense busing system that is basically like, he's got all of these buses, he calibrates the compressors with a sine wave and has a certain, kind of like I was talking about with like, just always listening at the same point.
Yeah. That was
so his drum, like there's an A-bus compressor that's all of his drums and his bass going into a distressor. And so he's getting saturation and he's getting compression off of the distressor. The distressor is calibrated with a sine wave to give the sine wave 1 decibel of gain reduction and then a makeup gain to get it back to 0. And then he mixes all of his drums and his bass into that setting every time.
Yeah.
And it's like you're like sometimes templates are drag, but if you really are not into mixing, like maybe taking some steps to create a template and to create like these calibrated systems that it's like, if I just have these buses and I send my stuff to those buses and I never have to think about it that much. And I just like send the faders up into that thing. And I know that if I set this compressor up this way, and like a lot of people will tell you that's bad and that like your compression should always be adjusted depending on the track and the tempo of the track and whatever, but that's not totally true. You can definitely get some like roughly one-size-fits-all compressor settings for different elements, and that does help you with analysis, and it helps you speed up your workflow. It helps you not think so much about how you're treating individual sounds. So like,
dude, that's super cool.
Yeah, like Michael Brower, I think he calls it, it's like Browerizing should give you the results you're looking for if you type that into Google. There's a ton of interviews where he's talking about, and he basically has the same thing for guitars, the same thing for like pianos and keyboards, and then treats his vocals a very specific way every time, and treats the mix bus pretty much the same way every time. And it just is like a way to crank out pop tracks with good, clean, even mixes every time. And that could easily be adapted to mixing dance music or whatever.
No, I mean, I think that's super, super helpful, because I think it's kind of like a good metaphor, because like, I like metaphors. It's like everyone wants to fly the space shuttle. Everyone wants to fucking get their pilot's wings and go into space. Yeah. But like, no one ever, and everyone just talks about starting from like nothing and like landing on the moon. But it's like, you gotta learn how to like maybe hang glide first, and then like fly a shitty Cessna, and then like move up to a fighter jet. And it's like, and it's also like, this is something I just want to say, because like, this is something that for me was a big deal with learning about this stuff. It's not like a moral issue.
Yeah.
Like, you're not a shitty person if your mix is off. Like, you're just on your way. That's all
Yeah.
And
like,
I think a lot of people are turned off by the discourse of precision audio, because there is a lot of like that kind of like judgy compressor talk.
Yeah, I mean, like,
Earsluts
is a toxic fucking website. And
Earsluts, it's toxic. It should be shut down. It's like the asshole of the internet.
There's so many, and it's the same thing as like people on Twitter or anything. Like, the people who are out there like screaming dogmatically about anything are probably not like that well informed. Like, they're probably people who like don't have a career in audio and they just are upset about it, and they'll complain on Gearsluts or Reddit or whatever.
Right.
So like, yeah, definitely. Tracks are a snapshot of where you're at in a specific time. It doesn't mean there's no requirement or right or wrong way to do it, and there's nothing wrong with like creating systems that allow you to work faster or think less, because if you're thinking less, it's always better. Like the more you're thinking about individual things, the more you ruin it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I find that because I'm just going to double down on what you're saying, is like they're a snapshot of where you're at, but it's also like, ideally, your tracks are like a snapshot of your consciousness at that time.
Yeah.
Like I use, like people are like, oh, Jace, you know, you make so many tracks, you're so productive. Yes, I'm not going to say I'm not, but the reason I am, and what I, like my goal and what I'm trying to do with this productivity is like, you know, growing up, my dad always told me to keep a journal.
Yeah.
And like every therapist I've ever had has been like, well, are you journaling? Are you journaling? And I'm like, no, I'm not fucking writing my feelings down, because like I have a complicated life inside my head, you know, as does everyone, but like I don't necessarily express myself through words in that way. But what I do is I make tracks all the fucking time. And that is the diary. Each one of those, if I do it right, if I don't overthink it, right, it takes me back to that time and place, those feelings, those thoughts, those memory, everything, right back there. Like better than any kind of journal for me would be, you know. And I think that's, and again, I don't, there's just not a lot of discussion of stuff like this, because it's like, yes, you can use music to, you know, fortify your mental health. I'm sure you do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
And I think that like just to like follow this wave of derailing that we had, it's like it's all of this technical stuff. It's important to like always remember that all of these technical things are for the purpose of serving like the emotional content that you're trying to deliver. Because like every track is ideally like an emotional statement, and it might be very abstract or it might be very literal, whatever the case is. Like the music is about making people feel something. Yeah. And so all of this technical shit, you can't, if you lose sight of that and you start thinking about the technical shit at the foreground, like then all the life is gone and you're not doing what you set out to do. So like you have to like just learn this stuff and keep in mind that you're learning this stuff to accomplish the goal that you started with when you were just messing around in your bedroom for fun. Yeah. It's the same thing. And like, you can't lose sight of that thing that like, I started making music because I wanted to do X, Y, and Z. And it's all to serve the goal of like emotional connection. Absolutely. or like subliminal messages, or however you want to explain it. But it's not about like your music is good or bad because you know this technical thing, or you don't know this thing, or you don't do that, or you do this, whatever. Like that's all people like way overthinking.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, but again, I mean, I think like talking about something like music, and for me, it was like, I didn't even believe that you could actually communicate coherent sensations through music until like a couple years ago. Like it was something like I didn't have the creative maturity to like buy it. Like I just thought it was like cool shit. It was just cool shit. And I'm gonna make some cool shit.
But cool shit is like an emotional connection.
But also cool shit is an emotional connection. Exactly. It's a sensation.
Yeah.
And you know, and so it's kind of like music for me is this pure, like calling it a language is actually a disservice to what music is. Music is music. Yeah. And it's like language, but it's capable of communicating pure sensation across with like extra culturally and all this kind of shit. Like it is magic. It's fucking for real. I believe in it. I have like old jazz guy spirituality.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So That's so cool. And you know, I think what I'd like to do now, if you're okay with that, is we've talked for a while. I want to see if and I want to be sensitive to everyone's time, and I want to be sensitive to your time, Clay.
I'm doing nothing.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep talking, but I want to open it up for maybe a few minutes of questions.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm gonna unmute everyone, and we can have more of a group discussion if you guys kind of want that. Is that cool? Is that cool with everyone?
It's good by me.
Okay. Okay. I have asked everyone who cares to unmute themselves and just start rapping. Anyone have any questions? Otherwise, we'll just keep going. We can do another track. Actually, I wanted to play, if I may play a track, I want to play my version of this. That's kind of night and day.
Yeah, if you play, why don't you play yours and then play the mastered, like finished version of this? You got both?
Yeah, I do. I'll pull it up. All right.
No.
Oh, hey Sam.
I wanted to ask what the polyrhythm was. I think like 65.
Is that cats or something?
No, I think the synth. I don't know. This is one.
Oh, that was one of mine. That's in my track too, Sam. We can talk about it. And we can get granular and figure it out.
We had very briefly touched on this topic at the beginning before we opened the track up. That some of these were really easy to adjust, and some of them were not. And this was one that I think was not. It's a really weird synth line. And
I mean, that's one of the coolest bass lines I've ever come up with.
Yeah, it's cool. And so what I ended up doing, because I don't remember what the original BPM was, but this is at 160. I ended up doing a bunch. I don't know how clearly you can see my screen, but in certain places, I ended up like really cutting this up and then just doing some fades here and there on the synth. And there is some like clickiness and stuff.
No, but it makes it slide around. It makes it slide around. That's cool, man.
Right. So I ended up like adjusting the rhythms of your synth in certain places, partly because it just wasn't sitting right to take the whole line and change the tempo that drastically. I'm sure this was not above 140. I don't know. The original tempo is probably
those sections. It was probably like 137.
Yeah. So it's a pretty big jump in tempo, and it wasn't working to just take the whole thing and warp it and pitch it up. So yeah, I got super choppy with these, and like at certain points I kind of killed the polyrhythmic aspect of it by just making these little loops. And then at certain points I let it really fly and keep layering over itself for longer periods of time.
The funny thing is I'm pretty sure I did the exact same thing in my version.
Yeah, I bet.
Because that bass line is from the MC202.
Yeah.
And
it's also like it's polyrhythmic, but it's also drifting all over the place.
It's a weird time signature, and it's like a loosey goosey DIN-sync to MIDI conversion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I guess like it's funny to talk about like you were mentioning jazz stuff and whatever, and like when I'm working on this kind of music, like I rarely ever think like I want to do like a 7/5 or something. Like it's just like does that sound cool over the drums? Great. Like I'm not really generally too analytical about it, and maybe I did sit there and like try to figure out the math of how to get it to line up the way I wanted to, but I don't remember doing that. It's just like kind of chopping shit to where it feels good was my approach, I think, on this.
Yeah, I mean, is that something you learned in jazz college?
Chopping stuff up?
No,
No, that
doing what feels good.
kind of.
Yeah, no, I'm that's not even a diss. That's just like
But
man, I wish I'd learned that in school.
but that was definitely more theoretical. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's also just like if you're kind of being forced to study certain things, then you're just in an academic mindset. And like the big reason why I don't really interact with that scene as much anymore, and why I got into this stuff, was like I didn't have that analytical academic mindset, and I could just turn knobs and slap stuff around and chop it up, and like it was kind of like an even further abstracted mentality of the way that I would like play physical instruments.
Yeah, I mean that's like it's a really interesting like institutional critique. It's like let's say you love butterflies, so you like find the butterflies, catch them with the net, kill them, pin them to the wall, because you love butterflies. Like that's one way to love butterflies. And then the other way to love butterflies is to see butterflies and be like, damn, that's beautiful. Right. So I'm gonna switch to my screen real quick.
Yeah.
And play the Our World rough cut. So I'm just gonna share Winamp. And then I got to do the audio. Where are the advanced options again? Oh, there it is. Okay. Come on, little doggy. You guys can hear that, right? Can you guys hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a cool track, man. I totally forgot about that one.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, Sam, to your point, as you hear in my version, my version is actually more on the grid than yours, Clay.
Yeah.
Like you made it way slipperier, actually. Mine is still pretty like boom, bum, 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 you know, kind of like on some kind of grid, even though it is in a weird time signature because it's from the 202. So I probably just punched in like 12 notes and just gave them arbitrary note lengths.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to play the mastered version, which is really great, of the LW version, if my computer fucking behaves. But yeah, anyone hit us, smash that question button or whatever. While this
we can do it in the chat. We can do it in the chat too.
You can do it in the chat too if people are more comfortable that way. Well, I just pull this thing up. Okay, here we go. Oh, come on, man. Come on, man. You guys hear that, right? Did you guys hear that?
Yeah, it's
Okay. It's what?
I can't tell if it's just the Zoom compression or if it sounds like it's your mic audio, but either way, it's whatever.
Hold on. I gotta stop screen sharing and share this other window. There we go. Cool. Skipping ahead. Man, that's great. And that snare, as you described, really hits like the little click of the high snare really adds some attack to it, where and then the low snare that's just like, as you said, from Ableton, really gives it some oomph.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like that whole your snare sounds like shit meme is like, it's pretty true. And I'm not at all claiming to have great snares, and in fact, I like often don't use them. But the biggest key is layering snares, and I generally am not super into layering drums. I like to get a good sound and just work with that from the start. But with snares, I feel like oftentimes it's necessary to do some layering, either to give it more knock and low end, or to give it more space to poke out in the high frequencies around like all of your synths, because it's just so easy for a snare to get buried and either just sound too thuddy or too snappy, and you really want that like that like thinking about the concept of like how do you mic an acoustic snare drum, where it's like there's a mic on the top and a mic on the bottom, and you want both of those sounds to come through to give you that nice full snare sound.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's like I mean, a lot can be said for just listening to acoustic drums, right? Like, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the snares that I like, and I don't always do this with my tracks, but like snares should make like a cracking sound.
Yeah.
Like it should be like crack, like, or boing, or, you know, but like there should be some kind of like real heavy attack and like some kind of resonance. But, you know, I just listening to Chemistry and Love reminded me of, were you intentionally quoting Metropolis by Kraftwerk? I'll show you, listen. I love it. Maybe not so much, but like, check this out. I bet this works. Totally works. Anyway, I thought that was kind of a cool, like a historical reference, you know?
Definitely not anything intentional. I mean, like, when I took your version apart and started to rework a lot of these, this one in particular, I was just probably thinking about like faster Drexciya tracks, you know, which there's definitely Kraftwerk in that.
Totally.
So I didn't specifically reference Kraftwerk
I was just thinking that long portamento on that one.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of cool, and that's also that's like a Metropolis is like a Kraftwerk deep cut. No one knows that track.
Yeah.
That's man, I love that one from the Man Machine. Nahal, did you have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I had. Let me. Hello. So yeah, I had a question about dealing with low end frequencies, and it seems like it's really hard to mix properly, dealing with the low end. I mean, without, or at least you can only go so far. You know, because of like the physical limitations of that your setup may have, like a room that's not ideal, or you know, whatever it may be. So I guess like there are obviously like visual aids with like a lot of, you know, whatever, using like spectrum analyzers or whatever, like the plugin, like dynamics processing plugin is showing you visually. But I guess I wonder, like, to what degree if you think it's maybe like an exercise in futility. Maybe that's too strong to say, but like
a fool's errand, perhaps.
For sorry, what?
A fool's errand.
Yeah, yeah, that's better. To what degree is it a fool's errand? Trying to deal with the low end with less than ideal setup, I guess.
So, can I say something before you give the right answer, Clay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I didn't start to get my low end really under control until I started DJing with my tracks. and by extension, playing them at volume on sound systems. Because for me, I'm not engineering this shit to sound good on a pair of Barefoots. I'm engineering this shit to sound good on a Function One, on a Turbo Sound, on a JBL rig. You know, that's my target for me personally. It doesn't have to be everyone's target. You know, it's no right or wrong. But like starting to get a sense of what I had done and what was problematic, and then like listening to my tracks and being like, holy shit, I got to mix out of this because this is like woofy. It's just like woof, 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 woof. Sounds like the dogs are out, you know. And then you know, but you also know like, oh, if it's kind of woofy, that's like the 200 hertz, like you got too much of that bass in that.
Yeah.
And so like that's kind of how I do it. And now because I don't have the club anymore, which fucking sucks, I when I want to figure out, because I had to do this because when I played in Bari, we had a sound system, and I wrote a track for the party, at the party. And I was like, well, I'm just gonna, it's a wing and a prayer with this bass because I just had my headphones. But what I've been doing, and this is what like the trap guys do, you just listen to it on like a Bluetooth speaker. And if your bass comes through clearly on a Bluetooth speaker and doesn't overpower, if it overpowers everything, it's fucked up. But if it comes through strongly and clearly on a Bluetooth speaker, it's probably gonna work on a rig.
Yeah, that's
Right.
kind of interesting. I feel like, sorry to interrupt here, but I feel like in that way you're kind of like exploiting like a maybe shitty setup in some way to give you information that's helpful about.
I'm assuming that the frequency response spectrum of that speaker is shitty and fucked up, and that it's gonna spike certain frequencies, and it's gonna spike, you know, because a lot of these are made for like people that don't really give a shit about music. So they're just made to make anything sound passable. And like how you do that is by like spiking certain frequencies. And it turns out a lot of those frequencies are the same frequencies that are kind of hot on sound systems. The other thing that I used to do that I don't have them anymore, but I had a pair of Sennheiser HD 280 Pros. And I found that the frequency response really sounded like a PA. And I thought I had discovered something unique. And then I was talking to Ian Clark, you know, who's also a sound guy, who, for everyone at home, it's Ian Clark does the Perspex records and Looky Lookies, the Detroit Electro legend. He's like, oh no, these sound like PA systems. Like that's why everyone uses them, is because they sound like PA systems, and you can actually dial in your bass with the headphones. So that's what I know, and then I'll let Clay take it away.
Yeah, I would say I'm totally with you. I reference low end against hip hop, and specifically contemporary hip hop, more than I reference low end against techno. The way that those guys work with 808s.
Like God's Plan by Drake, you want to hear a good 808. Fuck.
Right. Yeah, like any musical taste aside, 40 is a great producer, and they have great mix engineers, and those 808s are always going to sound good, whatever you think about Drake himself. In terms of like technical shit, I can show you a couple things that might be helpful. First, I mean, just continuing that is like, you don't have to reference Drake tracks, but referencing tracks is obviously going to be super helpful there. Any kind of like anything that you know deeply that you've heard on sound systems a million times, and you know like that's a track that has really good low end.
That's super good point, man. That's
just
a super good point.
Just like level match what you're working on to a track that you know really well inside and out, and you know its frequency range, and that's a helpful thing. Headphones are great if your room is, and depending on what kind of speakers you have and what frequency range they put out. Checking stuff on headphones is sweet. It's not the most accurate in terms of low end, but it's definitely helpful if you're combating a small set of speakers in a less than ideal room. The other thing that I would say, this isn't a good one for it. Let's just,
You know, of course, like familiarity goes a long way. Just kind of the more you work in this room, then
there's also, I mean, there are technical ways that you can do stuff. Like just sweep sine waves in your room, you know? If you do like a fixed oscillator at a sine wave and you just take this frequency down and you start at whatever, like just start at like 20 hertz and slowly like keep just notching this up one by one and listen to exact like 1 hertz changes in low frequency sound in your room and go from like 20 hertz to 200 hertz or even up all the way through and identify like at mix position, this frequency is super loud. This frequency is super quiet. This frequency is like the same as all of these, and then I get to 110 and there's another spike again and whatever. And you can start to like identify problematic frequencies in your room and frequencies that are not audible in your room. So that can just help you, like spending a bit of time for a while sweeping frequencies with a pure sine wave is a great way to like figure out what's lacking and what's overemphasized in your room, which can help you make more informed decisions. I mean, low end is tough because most people probably don't have a big enough room, especially if they're in New York or Berlin.
Yeah.
Or like any big city to fully produce even 40 hertz bass wave. Like a lot of us are working in really, really small square rooms and it's just not gonna happen even with a sub because of the physical constraints of your space. There's also, you know, there are room correction options, but that's not really gonna give you low frequencies that your speakers can't reproduce. So if it's a matter of like, how do I know what's happening between 20 and 40 hertz when my speakers don't produce anything below 47 hertz? That's where you go to headphones, that's where you go to car tests, club tests, and eventually like you get a few tracks that are in the right ballpark, and then you can use your own tracks as references. You know, I would say initially like referencing tracks that you're very familiar with, especially helpful if you've DJ'd with them, you felt them on club systems, whatever. And I mean, in general, I would say that like people tend to always mix with either way too much bass or not enough bass if they're working out of home studios. And it tends to be pretty consistent because of the room acoustics. So if you're able to identify that like, I'm generally not putting enough sub into my tracks, then you know that, you can adjust for that. If you're putting too much, you can adjust for that as well. And then there's a lot of things where it might just be a matter of understanding how to achieve certain bass sounds. Like,
That's a good point.
You know, like if you are going for a really, really pure, like 40 hertz sine wave kind of sub, that's generally not going to be present in your mix in an audible way. That's more of like a feeling frequency. That's like a physical frequency. And so maybe what you actually want is saturation to give you the like fake version of that at higher frequency harmonics, which like I think I did this a lot initially, and I think a lot of people probably do this, is like I want this really heavy clean sub in my track, but to get that to feel right, you end up making your sub way too loud, and it kind of kills your headroom. And what is actually happening, if we go back to hip hop, like those low 808s, like those are getting a lot of saturation. They're getting a lot of like stereo spreading in the upper mids. There's a lot of like psychoacoustic treatment to low frequencies that help your bass be more perceptible without actually overwhelming your mix. And it still applies to a sound system as much as it does to smaller sets of speakers when you get that right. You know, because if your low frequency is slamming the limiters in the club, your bass isn't going to sound right either. So I think that like looking into kind of the like perceptual trickery that happens with things like max bass, and there's some hardware versions of that as well, things like subharmonic synths, and like DBX has a lot of things like that kind of like fake out this very like specific like overtone series basically with saturation that kind of tricks your ear, because like you hear these upper frequencies of the bass and your ear kind of fills in the lower frequencies. It's just like a way that your brain perceives ultra low sound. So it might, if you're asking about mixing, that might be something to think about. If you're asking about room acoustics, it's just kind of getting really familiar with your space, and the low frequency is really, really difficult. It's still a thing that I am constantly adjusting. And I've heard many producers who I would regard as like very talented and like veteran producers who all seem to agree that like the low frequencies are really the last thing that anybody gets together in a very accurate way. So it's a tough one. Yeah.
No, it's super interesting, and I think that almost, that's like what I said before you started speaking, was like that was me shooting from the hip and just talking about like, you know, my method. But basically what you did is you use science to explain why my method works. Like, why can you hear what you think is a 40 hertz sub on a Bluetooth speaker when that speaker can't even recreate that frequency at all? It's the harmonics, it's the saturation.
Yeah, if you like to just name drop some people who I feel like are very inspiring in terms of the way they deal with low end from like a hip hop realm. Alex Toomey, he does tons of streams, and he's like showing a lot of stuff on Twitch lately. Really good mix engineer, really great with 808s. Then Mike Dean, who is Kanye's producer, really great with low end. And Jason Joshua, who mixes a lot of like Mike Will Made It stuff. He mixed Despacito and like a bunch of major radio jams. And like the way that those guys are working is really applicable to what we're doing, more so than most other methods that you might find from pop producers and like radio producers and hip hop producers, because that is club music, and like that is meant to be played on big sound systems. So the way that they're working is like they've created this way of getting the 808s to translate to your earbuds and your iPhone speaker and your shitty JBL or Beats Pod Bluetooth speaker, and also the club sound systems. So I think that like looking into hip hop 808 stuff specifically can really translate because an 808 sub is basically a sine wave, like, and that's mostly what we're using for bass frequencies in techno or any dance music. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I mean, that helped. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really, like, the low frequency stuff is really hard.
I think it's interesting maybe how this relates to what you guys were saying earlier about the sort of when you're actually listening to a track like a techno record or something on a big sound system, there is that sort of maybe incorrect collision or overlap you were saying of like a bass drum and sub bass.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like that sort of interaction, it's like you kind of don't really quite comprehend what that is until you hear it on a big system.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I didn't understand anything having to do with any of that shit at all until I came here to Berlin and started hearing the music that we love at high volumes on the regular. And then you realize that in like a great, you know, I'm always going on and on about like, you know, Mills, but you know, whatever, I'm going to, you know, like Sugar is Sweeter, right? Like that, there's so much weird hidden kind of like mistake sub in that track. That's like, that's like the gold standard for me for like the unexploded ordnance, like techno shit, like that Our World track. I wasn't referencing to it because I try not to reference personally, creatively. I don't reference techno to techno. I'll reference like for techno, I like to use like optical tracks, like old neurofunk rollers, like from the late 90s. Like if it bangs, if optical makes it bang, I can, you know, figure something out. But like I always have Sugar is Sweeter like in my head for just these kind of like, for like, it's the inspiration for the accident. You know what I mean?
I think also just like one other note with low frequency, I think a lot of times it's, there's an issue with trying to do too much in the low frequencies. You know, there's a reason that like a lot of tracks that we think of as like classic early tracks, the sub is really, really simple, or it's filtered 909 toms. And like, there's not a ton of movement, and they're often like you have to think about, I mean, you don't have to, but if I'm trying to explain it, like you think about, when I was talking earlier about how most rooms that we work in actually can't even physically produce low frequencies in a, like to create a full wave. Like when you're in a club setting and you have like 6 or more giant subs and they're transmitting these like huge sound waves through a ton of bodies. And so there's like certain elements of like subs feeling really long and like full and like flowy that might not actually be the case if you listen to that sub isolated, you know, like you actually want space in the low frequencies because the way that the physical sound waves develop in a room create some additional like tail on the sounds, you know? So there's a lot of like clarity in the low end that gets lost by a really like glidey synth that like is playing these maybe it's only 4 notes, but like there's not any space between those 4 notes. So then your whole low end just turns into this like unperceptible thing. So I guess that is something I would say to keep in mind as well with low frequencies. It's like maybe you want a slightly shorter decay than you would naturally think when you're working on smaller speakers, because when you put those frequencies through air physically on a big subwoofer, it carries a lot more weight behind it.
Yeah.
I don't know, just
Well,
a
no,
random
it was
thought.
like almost an object. Like, I mean, it is an object. Like, it becomes a physical phenomenon that
Yeah.
is beholden to like gravity and interference and all this.
Yeah.
Yeah. One sort of related thing here that I thought that I read. This was actually something that one of our favorites, Carlos Souffrant, was discussing in an old interview of his I was reading.
What a legend! I got to get him on FaceTime.
And
sure.
how your kind of like preferences of sound systems and spaces that you hear this music in. There are like people have like different aesthetic preferences, I guess. Like I have the interview here. He says, the question is, if you were an architect and could design the place you'd play at, what would it be like? And Carlos says, I like to play in warehouses and I don't care about having the best acoustics. I'm not an audiophile. I actually like bass that is out of proportion. I prefer quantity over quality.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to say some other stuff. But yeah, that I thought, that sort of preference he's stating there is part of like a larger experience in the club that he finds appealing.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot to that, and I would agree with that generally, is like, I would much rather have way more subs than I need and be able to, if I'm speaking from like a live PA perspective, I would rather have way more subs than I need and be able to like create this like physically overwhelming feeling with a lot of subs running at a lower level than, like, they're not maxed out. Whereas a lot of parties that we'll go to, or clubs even, aren't, they're running like 6 subs or 4 subs, and those subs are running at like full power. And I think what he's saying is something that I would agree with. Like, I want tons of bass because that tons of sub frequency is a huge part in creating that like kind of tranced out mindset that is like the ideal raving scenario. It's like that physical like hug from the low frequency is a big part of like, I would say like the ability to have one of those like transcendent nights where like the sound quality might not be that great, but when you're like enveloped by bass the whole night, like that has a huge impact on that state of mind.
Absolutely.
Like the sound system at No Way Back, for instance.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that.
Right.
Not the best sound system in the world, but we've also been to the parties where there's not enough bass.
Yeah.
You're just like, this just sounds like they're playing fucking music in here.
Yeah.
Like I didn't come here to just listen to a bunch of music.
Yeah.
You know?
And that's a really tough thing to fight with club owners and whoever. It's like, people often are not happy about the idea of buying a ton of subs and they're expensive. And it's like, yeah, but it's probably fine. But like that kind of stuff, that's like the real like magic of this kind of music that we love, is like the psychoacoustic trickery and trippiness of like what happens when you just overwhelm people with certain frequencies,
especially when you're on psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I mean, for me, like literally, like that's that moment when the sound becomes physical. That's basically a miracle.
Sure.
It's basically a miracle. It's kind of like the interdimensional transmission is that like something that is from one sense it's synesthesia. It's one sense turning into another sense.
Yeah.
Like that, and only above like 90 decibels with the right sound system does that shit happen. But like that's, that's it for me. I mean, it's like if my tracks fucking grab you in that way, then the bass is perfect. It doesn't matter if it's kind of muddy. If it sends you somewhere, then it's on point.
I think it's like we were talking about earlier. Again, it's important to keep in mind that like a lot of the like holy grail tracks are not particularly accurate. There's a lot of great tracks that we love and lose our minds to that have really messy low frequencies. And all of that technical knowledge is just in service of pulling out an emotional reaction that you're looking for. And it's like, it's okay if your bass is fucked up if it's a really cool track. Like, people are still gonna think it's a really cool track.
Yeah.
Even if it's got too much bass. And also, if it's got too much bass, you always have either the sound tech who can turn the bass down, or the DJ can do that with the EQ on the mixer. Like, there's ways to adapt to a less than perfect production.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like a lesson I learned when I mixed my first record with Brendan. I had a lot of sounds in the mix that maybe for me, it's about, does the bass have an attitude? Is there a disposition and a vector to the bass? So it's kind of like, is it just bass, or does it have like attitude? Does it have an attitude? Is there, again, we're talking about communicating sensation. So it's about like, is it it's weird. It sounds kind of fucked up, but like, does it not sound fucked up enough? Like, that was Brendan's whole thing. He was kind of like, you got this sound it's weird, but it's not that weird. So like, either make it way weirder or just drop it. And like that, I was just like, and learned so much from that session with him. Again, got to get him on FaceTime. That'll be a good one. But like, yeah, I mean, it's about like, if your bass is muddy, I don't know, maybe make it muddier. Like, you know, like if you can't fix it, make it crazy. That's the Loveland way.
It's interesting to think about that with like kind of just a simple example of like a sine wave. Like when you listen to like a Source Direct record or something like that, and it's like a sine wave sample that they're working with, but they're like, I don't know, they're adjusting the amplitude envelope how they want it, and like using compression how they want it. It has like, I don't know, a lot of attitude, what you were saying, even though it's just a sine wave.
Well, with Source Direct is a great example because they were doing everything on, at best, S2000 samplers until the later stuff. But basically, those samplers added artifacts and saturation to all of the sounds. So then it becomes like when they sample the 808 kick for like, you know, that, but you hear a whole other dimension of that sound just because it's a sample.
Yeah.
And that's fucked up shit, quote unquote. But like, you need it.
Yeah. And I mean, just like one more technical thing to think about with low frequency is like, you're more or less always gonna have issues in like 3 particular places with your low frequencies. And it's really a useful thing to do. Let me just, just give you a quick visual. Take a track, anything, into your DAW and like isolate frequencies, you know? Like put an EQ on here and just take a track and play the track, and if you have the ability to solo a single band of an EQ, that's great. And if not, you can hear it just by spiking an EQ band, and like take some tracks and just go through like the entire frequency range and like listen to like where are, like, what is the actual punch of a kick drum? What is the actual sub? At what point does the punch of the kick drum turn into the sub? Yeah. And then like, at what point do I get this like real boxiness out of the low mid frequencies and whatever? And you start to just like be able to identify certain ranges with common problems. So it's kind of a thing that can be helpful. Like a lot of times you might actually want to turn down the fundamental frequency of your sub, and that might all of a sudden create this clarity because the sine wave is a little loud in that lowest harmonic. You know, depending on what kind of saturation you're doing, maybe just turn that down, or maybe there's this point where the kick and the sub are fighting like just above 100 hertz, or maybe the kick has too much in the like 400 range. Like I think that like just taking tracks, also using a 3-band EQ and just like killing everything except the low frequencies on a track, and just listen to the low frequencies on a track and be like, what is actually happening down there? And then spiking frequencies with only the low frequencies playing, like everything below 200 hertz or whatever. And like, you really make sense of where things sit, and you don't have to like fight it too much. You can just start to identify, like, if I'm noticing this kind of problem that you identify as like boxiness or muddiness or whatever, those things tend to happen in similar frequency ranges always. So doing those little like ear training exercise kind of things is awesome. If you're bored or you just feel uninspired, like that's a great time to just like sweep a fucking EQ over a track. And,
Yes.
You know?
Absolutely. And I mean, invariably when I'm doing shit like this, like if I'm kind of like breaking, you know, fucking around with audio in, you know, if I'm like, maybe not, I don't have any like real ideas for what I want to do. By the time I spend, you know, half an hour zooming through some frequencies, I've got a new idea for a track.
Totally.
You know, and it, you know, and it's not about like, you know, like copying that, but it's just kind of like, oh, but like, what if it did spike here? Like that's
right, and it's also just because you put your mind into this like analytical mindset of just like, oh, I found where that kind of thing usually happens, and then all of a sudden your brain is like, oh shit, well now I know how to make that thing happen. Like you're just like, if that's that kind of stuff, like I love like this, like usually my like exploration into like trying to learn new stuff is when I'm not feeling particularly inspired to make stuff. And it does always help, because it either helps me fix a problem in something that I already made, or it gives me an idea for a new thing to try. And every single time you do something like that, you get to look that much better at producing. And even just at hearing the way that you hear things is super crucial.
Yeah. I mean, just practicing listening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah.
I mean, again, this is what I've learned from listening to like I've been listening to a lot more like jazz, but like practicing listening. And then like, you know, when you listen to like an old like Pharoah Sanders recording or something like that, and then you like listen really closely, and then maybe you can hear the floorboards in the studio squeak, that kind of shit. Like that has really expanded my mind and attuned me to a lot of things that I think otherwise it just, and then it helps me find like the clicks and the pops from when I have like poorly chopped samples in my tracks.
Yep.
Like that's it like really is just like you have to like we all have to learn to listen.
Yeah, and every little bit like that can help you buy just the slightest bit more headroom or the slightest bit more clarity or something like that. It's all just part of the process of like slowly opening yourself up to hearing these really minute details over time. There's no rushing that. Like,
it's a kind of meditation.
Yeah.
It's a kind of radical presence and meditation. It's spiritual. Sorry, what were you
I'm curious if they're like, you know, doing these sorts of like listening exercises with, you know, tracks that we're familiar with and we love. Like, I guess, Clay, I'm curious if there's one sort of artist maybe that you gleaned the most insight from, or that you've listened to them. Like, for example, we've talked about Mark Renestis a lot, you know, and listening to like a Rhythm and Sound record. And like, I know you use, is it Queen of My Empire as one of like a test tracks when you're setting up sound and doing live sound?
Yeah, that's usually the first track that I would check a PA with. Yeah.
Right. And so I guess, you know, you've listened to his music, not just recreationally, but quite, you know, in this sort of like analytical sense as well. And yeah, I'm wondering if, I mean, I don't know if you had any particularly like enlightening moments with not necessarily him, but like maybe, you know, maybe him, another artist, or I don't know, or these sorts of exercises, you just kind of cast a wide net and like listen to everything doing these sorts of things, I guess is the best way to learn the
Yeah.
widest range of things. But
I mean, I think I don't. There's so many different random things. Like if I hear a track and I'm just like, that's really cool the way that they got that to happen, I'm just gonna probably try to dig into it sometime when I'm bored. But if you, in terms of like specifics, that whole basic channel rhythm and sound, and then like the early Monolake records are all like super foundational, crucial records in like not even so much in just like knowing in intricate detail every single track and thing that they did, but like just this broad sense of like if you, like we were talking about it earlier, it's just like picking the right sounds to occupy the right spaces and create this like overall like spherical 3-dimensional mix. And again, like those maybe are not like perfect mixes, but the choices of like when they use certain things, where they use them, how they put certain things together, it's always like with a very acute attention to detail and precision of like those subs sound so massive because there's not anything else getting in, like there's space for the subs to sound massive, you know? That low frequency is really beautiful on the rhythm and sound records, especially because there's nothing else down there. And the air on the top is really nice because there's so much space up there. And like the way that they place the delays and reverbs is like so spread out because there's not a lot of frequency buildup in the sides. Like it's that kind of stuff is really the most memorable. It's just like, if you keep things extremely simple and intentional, and that's kind of like, I have to remind myself of that constantly when I'm putting tracks together. It's like, I don't need this many channels, you know, like you can make a really amazing track with like 6 channels and a delay and a reverb. And so, yeah, I mean, that's like the biggest memorable lesson, I guess, from just repeated listening to that kind of stuff. It's just like pick the sounds wisely and pick things and shape things intentionally so that they occupy a certain space, and not just like the hi-hats have to sit here in relation, but it's like, how do I want the hi-hats to sit in terms of the left to right width, and in terms of the front to back depth, and then in terms of the height, in terms of how loud they are. Like I'm like trying to always think about like, not just that I need a hi-hat in this track and I put it in there and I turn the fader out, but like, where does that hi-hat physically sit? And where does the snare physically sit? And where, like always trying to think about like not just the fader and then putting a reverb on it, but like how do I take this sound and move it back? And like that kind of thing that they do really well. That's always in my head, for sure.
I think that's super fascinating, Clay. And I think the closest I get to that level of sophistication, right? Like I'm not that, but I like sometimes if I'm confused about what goes where and like who's occupying what pockets of sound of the frequency band, is like I just imagine that I'm conducting a band or an orchestra or something like that, and then you can kind of imagine, you're like, okay, so if the violinist was like way over in the cheap seats, like that's one way to kind of spatialize the audio. Like pick whatever it is that you're most comfortable with and use that as an armature for visualizing your music in a space.
I think that is a real marker of like, at least from my perception of like a really great producer, is like, not only are they writing great music that's like engaging emotionally, and this all feeds into the emotional thing. But it's like I have really cool music. This song is great. My arrangement is great, but maybe the way that it's constructed leaves kind of just like this band of mush. Like the sounds are all kind of on top of each other, and like you maybe only get left to right width from like reverbs and delays, and like all your sounds are kind of right down the middle. They're all kind of stacked on top of each other, and it creates this like boxy thing, and the music might be really cool, and we could still play that track. It doesn't matter. But so you can create like this even more emotionally impactful thing when you start to really place things in space. And that's like definitely a point of like elevated technique, in my opinion, when people not only are making cool music, but they're also playing with space, because that, again, that like trippy psychoacoustic stuff is what is really special at a party.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, I come at it from a slightly, maybe this is also helpful. I'm just going to say it.
Yeah.
You know, because I have a background in architecture, so I have a background in kind of thinking about space.
Yeah.
So in architecture, there are two words. One is very common and one is very rare. So one of them is tectonic, which is a way of describing a building that's made out of a series of parts that are assembled like a machine.
Sure.
Like it's tectonic. Sounds like it's made of stuff.
Yeah.
Other one, which is very rare and no one really uses, is called stereotomic, which means it's one thing that's been carved up. And for me and my interests, like I associate, like I used to listen to a lot of like IDM stuff, and like I don't think Autechre is like this, but I would say a lot of lesser imitations are kind of like these tectonic insect-like assemblages of parts.
Sure.
That does not resonate with me emotionally.
Yeah.
But like when again, rhythm and sound, it sounds like it's one sound that's been kind of sculpted into this evolving thing. Or like the old electro music department records do this.
Yep.
Like the Kotai and Mo shit, when you hear that shit out, it sounds like one evolving thing.
Yeah.
That's stereotomic sound, I think.
Yeah.
And I aim for that.
Absolutely.
You know, it's simply a matter of preference. But like thinking about it as like a building, and so it's like you could either have like a spindly skyscraper, or you could have like a bunker. Like whichever one you think is cooler is like a good metaphor to work with how you're mixed.
Yeah, and I think also this stuff, you know, can be tied in and thought about in terms of like tracks being a documentation of where you're at, but then you can apply that on a broader spectrum as well, and think about tracks as a documentation of like where we are all at.
Society is at, absolutely.
So if you think about something that's like, I don't know, some mega jam like No Way Back or I'm Strong or something, that is not actually super spaced out and like very particularly placed. Those are like ultra classics that still get played all the time and still sound awesome. And like then rhythm and sound being this other snapshot, and the way that things evolve and continue, and different people take different elements of each and start to create their own sense of the way they assemble things. So again, it's like, it's not like you have to have this view of spatial placement in music to make good music, because there's a lot of people who are still referencing like a 707 and a Juno and making cool kind of boxy raw jack and cuts, and that's also fine, and you know, no slight to that. But I think the coolest thing is like that little bit of like, it's really cool how rhythm and sound had this like very intentional, specific awareness to placement, and it's very cool the sounds that were used on this Chicago Acid record, and it's very cool the way that breaks were chopped on this UK record, and then assembling all of those things and creating your own take on like combining all those elements is the special sauce of like how it keeps evolving and stays interesting.
And I think it ties into a larger discussion of like that I think we should do volume 2 because it's starting to get kind of late here in Berlin.
Yeah.
But like, how the fuck? I mean, this is, as someone who finally found it, I can say it was a long search. But like, how do you find your sound? Like, how do we help each other find our sounds?
Yeah.
Because you can help people find a sound. You can't find a sound for someone, but you can totally help people, and you can cultivate a culture in which searching for your sound is accepted and celebrated.
Yeah, I mean, I think like just this kind of stuff definitely doesn't happen enough.
No.
Just like, it's cool to sit around and be like, oh, this record, that record, that record, but it's rare that we often get into like this like further conceptualization of why you do certain things and why you relate to certain sounds. And it's like just saying like, oh, I wish that, like, I'm happy with the stuff I'm writing, but I wish I could get it to be more three-dimensional. And then somebody might be like, okay, well, check this out. This is a thing. I know how these people did that, and I think that that might be something worth exploring. Or you just watch other people work. Like, that's honestly, like, even people that I don't find inspiring, I will watch them. If, like, I'm pretty much a sucker for any kind of Twitch stream or YouTube video of anybody working in a studio, whether it's like Bob Powers or Disclosure or, you know, Brendan or someone, like anybody. I will sit and watch anybody work in the studio, no matter what I think about their music, because it's, you just watch other people. It's like, oh, how did they do that? Oh, it's right there. I can watch them do that. And sometimes things that you might not even think would be impactful can be a game changer in terms of workflow, or the way you find problems, or the way you diagnose problems, or the way that you would approach treating sound. Like, you might be like, oh, I'm going to watch like somebody make a track because I want to hear how they put together ideas, but then you see them do something with a bus and you're like, oh shit, that's great. Like, I'm going to try that.
You know, there's
like,
a word for that phenomenon.
Yeah. What is it?
Gleaning. It's from when there's a whole great film, French film about gleaning called The Gleaners. But basically it's people that, like, when fields are cut, like, or potatoes are harvested, the machine comes through and harvests the potatoes, but it doesn't get them all.
Yeah.
And the gleaners are the people that come and find the little forgotten potatoes and then take them home and eat them.
Yeah.
And there are people that do this in markets. There are people that do this all over the world. But like, what you're doing is basically gleaning off of, like, you know, some pop producer or something like that.
Sure.
You're finding these little nuggets that are relevant to you, that are kind of like, holy shit. Like, they, you know, they may have said something in passing that they thought was no big deal, but like, for you, it's like, holy shit, that's the key that unlocks the shit.
Right. And I think, like, we already said this earlier, but like, ultimately the key to finding your own sound and making your own sound is to just fuck up a million times. And
you gotta fuck up a million times. Yeah, that's like the brute force way to do it, for sure. Yeah, you can't fuck up a million times. Story of my life. Story of my life. I'm a professional fuck up.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? Otherwise, we should probably leave it here. This has been the inaugural episode of FacedTime. Anyone? Any questions? Anybody? Mo, you look like you have a question. You look like you have a question. Do you need me to unmute you? All right. Jump in the mix. What's up? I can't hear you though. shit. Maybe do it in the chat if you got one. Oh, on the browser, I see. Now try it. Oh, okay. Oh, any acid specific? Acid talk. Okay, here we go.
Hey,
Okay.
what's the lowest frequency a 303 can reach? You know?
Mine can go, like, I've spectrum analyzed it, and it's pumping out frequencies below like 25 hertz.
Some of that might just be like noise though.
But it counts.
Pure, but you like, do you know the pure tone lowest note it can go? Yeah.
But my 303 is fucked up because it's got, like, you've heard that thing. It's got like way more attack and punch than like most of them do. Most of them sound like squirrely and like pretty and plastic man-y, but mine just like brute force nasty.
Yeah.
Which is why I couldn't get rid of it.
It's really hard. I can open up the session and show.
That was great, Clay.
I think client theme is a little bit.
Theme. Yeah.
It's more like
that's one of my acid lines too. So
it's really hard, and it's a really tricky one, especially if you have sub as well as the acid lines, because that tends to, like, the 303 can get down there and it can really get a bit messy. But some stuff that I have found to be helpful, I think this is the 303. No, where's the 303 on this track? Oh, this is only 202 on this track, but similar
principle, yeah.
This is, some of this stuff is kept from your original channel settings.
Yeah.
You use this JJP base, which, like, I would probably just do these things with.
I've outgrown that. It's a little embarrassing that you're showing people that. I've outgrown.
I mean, it works. It's like this is the kind of stuff like we were talking about earlier with just setting up templates and busing. Like, these plugins are pretty producer friendly. They're fast and they just work. But anyways, like, so it's pushing a little bit of sub, and you're getting like a little bit more like probably distortion from edge. I don't like these plugins only because
I don't like the non-precise ones. Yeah.
I want to know what edge means. Like, when I look at this plugin, it's like, what is edge? Is that saturation? Is it like transient shaping? I don't know. But anyways, this is what was on it, and I didn't really change it much. I maybe would have adjusted some of these things. I put some noise reduction on it, very minimal, just because there was some noise there, and I've found that with the 303 and the 202, if I have sub or if I have like a really big 808 kick that's really boomy, I actually will cut. I will do like a hard cut, and I don't like to do that generally, but I don't know if this will even come across with the Zoom compression, but we can push this a little bit. This is just fully dry. That's send only.
It's making my laptop rattle, so there's definitely a change.
Okay, so yeah, super subby, and you can probably hear that noise. Hopefully, there's like some top end noise from the old machines. That's pretty common. So a little bit of noise reduction. This thing is really bringing out this. It's kind of like what we were talking about, like this trickery of like maybe you actually want saturation on your sub to bring out these mid-range frequencies, and then your ear fills in the low frequencies when it hears it in the context of the whole mix. So this is bringing out a lot of upper frequencies. And then I'm cutting some of the low mids and boosting the fundamental frequency of the key of the synth line. And then, yeah, this hard cut here, a little bit more presence even, and rolling off even more of that super high frequency. Some reverb, nothing too crazy with the reverb, just like a chamber sound. And then that's going into a bus. And let's see what's on the bus. Same as most of the other stuff, saturation, and then a little bit of mid-side EQing, basically just taking out some low frequency on the sides. And that's only because I have the stereo reverb on the channel. I wouldn't need to do that if it was still a mono signal. But I'm kind of pushing so like mid-side EQing is rather than left and right EQing, it's kind of using this like method of like the mid is the sounds that occur in both speakers, and then the sides is stuff that's really only happening on the left or right side. So when you get reverbs in, you can use the mid-side EQing. I tend to use it somewhat carefully, but it can really help with pulling sounds closer to your face, like making things more in your face by pushing the mid frequencies. That tends to bring it up towards you, and then making things further spacey, more back in the mix with pushing the sides. So in this case, I'm pushing some of these upper frequencies in the mids only to kind of bring that bite out of this like 2-3K area. A little bit of compression, but generally this is kind of like different from the way that I would treat most of Andrew's 303s when they're in a really dense mix. Is I would just duplicate this track and have 3 instances of it, and I would hard pan these two, like full hard pan left and right, and then I would take both of these and pitch them up an octave and bring them down in the mix, so that it just helps a lot to get the 303 to stay like punchy in the low frequencies and in the middle, and then also like having the octave up hard pan left and right kind of helps the 303 stay present above the real like dense mid-range frequencies of the drums. And
Hey, Clay.
yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna switch. I'm switching to my phone because I have to restart this computer. I'm
Okay.
gonna pull up one of my more recent acid tracks. We could talk about that because what's crazy, and we haven't talked about this, but I have a very similar method for working with the proper 303 I call it filleting the sound. But where I'll split it up into frequency bands, and each frequency band I treat separately.
Sure, that's definitely another way to go about it. Yeah. But yeah, the 303 can be tricky. I think it tends to work best if it's in a very simple arrangement. You don't have to do a lot to it. And the denser the arrangement gets, the more I'm just looking to use saturation, and oftentimes I'm going to duplicate it and have one hard left, one hard right. The hard left and hard right are pitched up an octave, and the one in the center stays where it is. And I just drop the left and the right octave up versions to like just drop the fader all the way down, play the track, and push those side octave up instances of it until it just helps. All of a sudden, like it tends to just like, you just feel it and you don't really hear it. And it's the same kind of thing like with the track before, that snare layer. This stuff is not really audible, but it's like little trickery that helps things pop out above the rest of the mix. So that left, center, right trick with this left and right being an octave up is a really good one with 303s. If you're struggling to get them to be full in the low end, but also be present above the drums. I guess we can do way more in-depth acid talk, like looking at session files if we do a part 2 or something, but I guess like my quick tip for that is to duplicate and pitch up.
Yeah, I think my computer's about to go, so I don't think I'm going to be able to show the section file. But basically, Mo, like what I like to do is, and you can use this tool this technique compositionally as well. So, for instance, on my most recent acid track, the "Let Me Hypnotize You" cut, it has a main acid line that has very little modulation. It's basically just the bass. And I have the decay on the 303 dialed all the way back. So it's just like, and then what I do, I will repeat that. And so what I'll do is then I'll overdub another 303 line over the top of that one. That's all the modulations. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry, my computer is really not doing good. This thing is about to give up the ghost, I swear. I mean, it's earned its keep. But anyway, so like what I'll do is I'll layer on a completely different, well, like the same acid line, the same notes, but a completely unique set of modulations. That one gets high passed, and then that's the one that gets all the effects, like the flanger, the delay, or a little distortion. I don't like a lot. Everyone knows I don't like a lot of distortion on the 303. I think it's uncouth.
Yeah, but saturation versus distortion is definitely like,
all the time.
yeah.
Thumbs up all the time. Getting out the rat distortion pedal and running the 303 through there with the sawtooth waveform, that is unacceptable.
I agree.
You've taken the sound of God and made it the sound of the devil. That's my opinion on that.
I think I keep going, but I just want to interject quick that like what you're talking about doing right now is, again, like going back to what we were saying about thinking about the way that like a band is recorded. That process is exactly the same as the way people treat an electric bass in a rock band, because gets the finger noise and like the upper harmonics get lost really easily in the mix when you're mixing a rock band. So oftentimes they're taking an amp signal and a DI,
much sauce when it comes to modulation,
and they're gonna over